Hello, my name is Phil Easter, historian and writer from Baltimore, Maryland, also known as the Amazing Memory Man. We are recording on Sunday, September 10th, 2023. This is story number 36 on my YouTube channel, which is Phil Easter, the Amazing Memory Man. Today we are reviewing past events, mostly from history and some from my personal life also, for every day in the month of September. We start with September 1st. In 1939, that was the day World War II began, when the German army invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. Also, on September 1st, 1972, I began one of the most interesting trips of my life. My mom and I had a trip to Europe for about 4 weeks, from September 1st to the 27th, 1972. We went to the countries of Denmark, Germany, Holland, and France. And in Germany, we saw the last several days of the 1972 Munich Olympic Games, as I will describe in a few minutes when we get to the dates from about September 5th to the 10th or so. That was the day our trip began, September 1st, 1972. We took a train from Baltimore to New York and then flew from New York overnight to Copenhagen, Denmark, arriving on September 2nd. Also, September 2nd in 1937 was the day that the founder of the modern Olympic Games, Pierre de Coubertin, died in Lausanne, Switzerland. He was 74 years old. He was the man who founded the modern Olympics, organized his first games in 1896 in Athens, and he was president of the International Olympic Committee from 1898 to 1925. So he died on September 2nd, 1937, the founder of the modern Olympics. September 3rd, going back to 1939, 2 days after Germany invaded Poland, that was the day Britain and France officially declared war on Germany. So the war was officially underway at that point. September 4th, on that day in 1979, on my wonderful 15-week trip to many parts of Great Britain and Ireland, I saw the famous actress Elizabeth Taylor outside a restaurant in Glasgow, Scotland. Elizabeth Taylor, famous actress who made many movies, most famously Cleopatra in 1963, and I happened to see her just for a few minutes outside a restaurant in Glasgow, Scotland in 1979. September 5th. On the night of September 5th, 1972, my mom and I took a train from Copenhagen, Denmark, overnight to Munich, Germany. While on that train, some men who were from Denmark, I think my mother and I were the only English-speaking people on the train from, let's say, primarily English-speaking. But I noticed these men from Denmark were listening to a transistor radio, and they seemed very nervous about something. And finally, one of them came over and said to us, "People have been shot. Munich is closed down." That's the way he said it. Well, we found out later, Munich wasn't totally closed down. But what was unfolding was the terrible, tragic events of September 5th and 6th, 1972, when 11 athletes from the country of Israel were taken hostage, and 2 of them had been murdered on the 5th, early on September 5th, and then shortly after midnight, European time, the other 9 were killed at the airport when 3 German police officers, sharpshooters, tried to take out the terrorists, but there were as many as 8 terrorists, and unfortunately the terrorists decided to pull pins on hand grenades, killed the other 9 hostages, and 5 of the 8 terrorists were also killed, and the other 3 were captured. But we found this out much later on the day of September 6th when we arrived in Munich, but it was a pretty scary experience on the train. We weren't sure what was happening, and it was just sketchy reports early on, and we weren't sure where the terrorists were in Munich and if transportation centers were in danger, like the train station where we were about to go to. And it was a very upsetting night. We did not have any sleep. Arriving in Munich then on the morning of September 6th, and went to a hotel where they had a television on, and instead of seeing a sports event from the main stadium, instead there was a memorial service for the Israeli athletes. You can imagine what a shock this was. We were looking forward to the last 4 or 5 days of the Munich Olympics. We got these tickets in August, only 1 month before. The trip came up pretty fast. It wasn't a trip that we had planned for a long time. Like some of our trips to Europe, we planned well in advance. We were looking forward to the last several days of the Olympics, and this terrible event happened, and there's a 180-degree change of emotion, knowing this was a terrible tragedy. And of course, subsequently, many people consider this event at the Munich Olympics to be the beginning of modern terrorism. And think of all the things that have happened the last 51 years, what we call international terrorism by that definition. Munich, Germany, 1972. Of all days we arrive, the second of those 2 days. Well, the International Olympic Committee was never faced with anything like this before, of course. There was debate whether the Games should continue or not, but I think they made the right decision. They decided there had to be some recognition of this terrible event. So I think September 7th was the day of declared official mourning. There were no events scheduled. So all these sports we would see, the tickets we had were listed September 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th. But actually we saw events on the 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th. So everything was 24 hours after the scheduled time for this last several days of the Munich Olympics. But also on September 6th in 1995 was the day here in Baltimore that a great event in baseball took place. The Orioles shortstop Cal Ripken Jr. played in his 2,131st consecutive game, breaking the great Lou Gehrig's record back in the 1920s and 30s, played in 2,130 consecutive games. So Cal Ripken Jr. on September 6, 1995, became the Iron Man of baseball. He's often called that, and he went on to play several hundred more games. And on September 20, 1998, he took himself out of the lineup, having played 2,632 consecutive games. Quite a record I don't think will ever be broken. Because the way it is nowadays, these guys are paid so much money and they get little injuries. They want to sit out a while to protect their $1 million salaries. So I doubt you're going to have anybody that dedicated willing to play several thousand games every single day for 14 or 15 seasons. It's very unlikely that record will ever be broken. And President Clinton and Vice President Gore both came to that game. That's how important they considered it. It's very rare that the president and the vice president of the United States ever attend the same event. They came that night on September 6, 1995. I watched that game on TV. I wish I could have been there in person, but it was very hard to get tickets for that, as you can imagine. September 7th, that was the day that Queen Elizabeth I of England was born in 1533. September 8th, going back to this Munich Olympics, that was the day we saw the first event, sports event. We saw a rowing competition and also some basketball games later that day. September 9th, at the 1972 Munich Olympics, that afternoon we saw judo, and then something interesting occurred late night. The gold medal basketball game between the USA and USSR did not begin until about 11:30 p.m. Munich time, very late. Now in the United States, It was like 5:30 in the afternoon or thereabout on the East Coast time, about a 6-hour difference between much of Europe and the East Coast United States. So that game went well past midnight where we were watching it, and it turned out to be the most controversial basketball game ever played. It was a very close game. Keep in mind, the United States had won every Olympic basketball game since basketball became an Olympic sport in 1936. Not just winning the gold medal, but winning every game of those tournaments. And usually they had to play 6 or 7 games of the Olympics. And all those games they played up until 1972, they won every game. Well, the game did seem to end with the U.S. up by 1 point, 50-49. But then the president of the International Basketball Federation, a certain Dr. Jones, came out of the stands and ordered the Brazilian referee to put up 3 more seconds. He said the Russians didn't have time to set up properly. And so that's what happened. And then a Russian player scored the winning basket, 51-50. And people were very upset about this. And there was no medal ceremony that night. There probably would have been a lot of boos if there had been. And already a lot of people were booing and very upset about this. It did not seem fair. And so the next day, a panel of 5 men voted 3-2 to still favor the Soviet Union in winning the gold medal. And the U.S. players did not accept their silver medals. To this day, they're kept somewhere in Munich in a safe deposit box, those 12 silver medals. So actually that was September 10th then, technically, because the game went past midnight. So, but what a day this turned out to be. We went back to our bed and breakfast house in the wee hours of the morning, just slept for a few hours, and because I wanted to see the final day of track and field competition at the Olympic Stadium, which began around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So we got to the stadium, and there were 9 final events in track and field that day, and the United States won 2. A relay race, but also what was really amazing, for the first time in 64 years, an American runner won the Olympic marathon. 24-year-old University of Florida law student Frank Shorter won the marathon. I have a photograph of him here, right here. That's in the stadium where my mom and I are among those 80,000 spectators watching this, and Frank Shorter won the Olympic marathon. The first time an American won since 1908 in London, 64 years before. That was one of the final track and field events that day. I enjoyed that competition very much. Heard the Star Spangled Banner played twice, and the Anthem of the Soviet Union was played twice, and also the little country of Finland, a very small country, also won 2 gold medals. A runner won the 1,500 meters, and also Lassi Viren won the 5,000 meters for Finland. Well, the Munich Olympics ended the next day on September 11th. We had tickets for the equestrian events in the afternoon, and then at night we watched the closing ceremony on TV at the bed and breakfast house where we stayed. And in retrospect, it is rather ironic, I think, that the tragedy in Munich a few days before and the games end on September 11th. No one then could realize that 29 September 11ths later would be the single most famous terrorist attack of all time. September 11th, 2001, when close to 3,000 innocent people died between the World Trade Centers that were hit by 2 airplanes and the plane that hit the Pentagon in Northern Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C., and the plane that crashed in the field in Pennsylvania, where it is believed a number of brave Americans charged the cockpit and tried to take it back from the hijackers. One of those men was speaking to an operator on his cell phone just a few minutes before. He was trying to reach his wife and wasn't able to. The operator promised him she would call him and tell her how much he loved her. And the last thing she heard him say was, let's roll. So it's believed a number of men charged the cockpit and tried to take the plane back, because that plane most likely would have gone to Washington, D.C. and struck either the Capitol or the White House. That tragic day that so many of us remember so well, 22 years ago, and that Tuesday afternoon, at that time on Tuesdays, I used to meet with a group of people about 2 o'clock in the afternoon for about 1 hour to talk about things. And well, of course, that day, that was the only thing we spoke about. And one of the ladies in the group, she's from New York City originally. She was concerned about, her relatives up there. And indeed, 1 week later, when we met the next Tuesday, September 18th, she mentioned that one of her cousins was one of those brave 343 New York City firemen who died at the World Trade Center trying to help people. And that was just so sad to hear. September 11th, 2001. Also, a few other events that have happened on that day. 1 year later, in 2002, the great Baltimore Colts quarterback, Johnny Unitas, who was very well known in the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s as one of the greatest quarterbacks in NFL history. Johnny Unitas died of a heart attack at age 69 on September 11th, 2002, 1 year after 9/11. And also the next year, in 2003, the famous singer Johnny Cash died on September 11th, 2003. September 12th, in 1880, the famous writer here in Baltimore, H.L. Mencken, was born. He wrote for the Sun papers for many years and published a number of books over the years. He was born September 12th, 1880. And also, in 1913, the great Olympic champion Jesse Owens was born. At the 1936 Olympics, he famously won 4 gold medals in track and field. And 40 years later, in 1976, he was given the Medal of Freedom by President Gerald Ford. I'm proud to say that 2 years after that, in 1978, I was able to meet Jesse Owens in person here in Baltimore when he came for a public appearance. I was able to meet him briefly, and he gave me his autograph, which I appreciated very much. One of America's great Olympic champions, Jesse Owens. September 13th, in 1982, that was the day that Princess Grace of Monaco, also her original name was Grace Kelly, a famous movie actress from the United States. Princess Grace had a terrible car accident in Monaco, and she died the very next day on September 14th. She made 11 movies. One of them was called To Catch a Thief, which is filmed primarily in Monaco and parts of southern France. And how ironic, because in that movie, you see scenes of her driving a car on some of those winding roads where she ended up having her accident many years later at age 52, dying on September 14th, 1982. But also, on September 14th, a wonderful day in American history, we go back to 1814, the Battle of Baltimore and the British siege of Fort McHenry, when British warships for about 24 hours attacked the fort from September 13th to 14th. And early in the morning of September 14th, Maryland lawyer Francis Scott Key, who was on a British ship because he was trying to negotiate the release of some prisoners, but the British captain said, well, when this battle is over, we can talk about that more, basically, but they wouldn't let Francis Scott Key off the ship. And for that 24 hours, he witnessed the British attacking Fort McHenry with cannon and rockets. But early in the morning of September 14th, he saw the flag still there, and thus he was inspired to write the Star-Spangled Banner, our wonderful national anthem, which, however, did not officially become our national anthem for over 100 years. Not until March 3rd, 1931, by act of Congress, did the Star-Spangled Banner officially become our national anthem. But Francis Scott Key wrote that wonderful song back in September of 1814. On September 15th, in 1982, that was the day the nation's newspaper, as it's sometimes called, USA Today, began publication. September 15th, 1982. I tried to find some copies that day, but here in Baltimore, but they must have sold out very early before I got out that day, and I never did get a first day copy, unfortunately. I got a copy the second day, but September 16th, that's not quite as special as a first day copy, but anyhow, that's the day the USA Today began publication. September 16th, a long time ago, in the year 1387, that was the day that England's King Henry V, King Henry V was born on September 16th, 1387. He was immortalized in Shakespeare's play, Henry V, and the story of the Great Battle of Agincourt, when, at about age 28, he defeated the French in the Great Battle of Agincourt in 1415, despite being outnumbered almost 3-1. There were about 20,000 French and only about 7,000 English that day, but despite being outnumbered, the English won a convincing victory. One of the great events of the life of King Henry V. September 17th, that was the day in 1787 that our Constitution was passed. U.S. Constitution ratified September 17th, 1787. But also, on September 17th, 1862, one of the great battles of the Civil War in Western Maryland, the Battle of Antietam. It was the bloodiest single day, not just in the Civil War, but in all of American history. About 8,000 men died that day in one great battle between Union and Confederate armies. 8,000 in one day. Now, the Battle of Gettysburg, which took place the next year, in 1863, I think more were killed there, but that was over a 3-day period, technically, July 1st, 2nd, 3rd. But for a single day, September 17th, 1862, the bloodiest day in American history in one of the great battles of the Civil War. September 18th, that was the day my maternal grandmother, Mary Arnold, was born in Cumberland, Maryland in 1879. And then she married Tom Robinson, and so she was known after that, of course, as Mary Arnold Robinson, my maternal grandmother, a wonderful lady who lived to be 95 years old. And when she died, I was 22 years old. So at least for the first 22 years of my life, I knew my grandmother very well. We called her Mimi, it was her nickname, but her proper name, Mary Arnold Robinson, born September 18th, 1879. And she died on June 18th, 1975, 95 years old. September 19th, that was the day of, we could call it our Olympic love story, because in Czechoslovakia, September 19th, in 1922, Emil Zetopek was born, and later he dated a young lady named Dana some years later, and he found out that she was born the same day too, September 19th, 1922. So they were both born the same day. Emil Zetopek competed in 1948 Olympics in London, where he won a 10,000 meter gold medal and a silver medal in the 5,000. 4 years later, in 1952, Helsinki, Finland, he won the 3 longest races in track and field, the 5,000 meters, 10,000, and the marathon. The only man to ever win all 3 of those in the same Olympics, amazingly. But on the same day of his 5,000 meter victory, July 24th, 1952, his wife Dana also won the women's javelin gold medal. She was quite an athlete too. So they're both born the same day and both won gold medals on the same day in the Olympic Games. Quite amazing. So September 19th was their birthday. September 20th, that was the birthday of the great Italian actress Sophia Loren. She was born that day in 1934 and made many movies over the years. One of my favorite was the 1961 movie about the great Spanish knight of medieval times, El Cid, where she co-starred with Charlton Heston as El Cid, and she played his wife in that movie. Sophia Loren, born September 20, 1934. September 21st, that was the day that I know, just my own personal life, years ago, one of my trips to New York City, we did in September of 1970. I've been to New York City about 10 times in my life. I do recall that was during the time period of one of our trips to New York City way back in 1970. September 22nd, in 1862, that was the day that President Abraham Lincoln issued his, let's say he publicly announced his idea for the Emancipation Proclamation. It would not take effect until January 1st, 1863, about 100 days later, a little over 3 months later. But that was the day he publicly announced his idea for the Emancipation Proclamation, which would free many black people from slavery in the southern states, but not in the 4 Union states that also had slavery, including Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri. And many people do not realize that. Many people that I meet assume that Abraham Lincoln emancipation freed all black people from slavery. It most certainly did not, but it did free a majority, those who were in the southern states, but not in the 4 states that were also Union states. That did not come about until shortly after the Civil War, when the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was passed in December 1865. September 23rd, that was the birthday of the great American singer Ray Charles. He was born September 23rd, 1930. September 24th was the birthday of the great ABC television sportscaster Jim McKay. He was born in Philadelphia in 1921 on September 24th. He came to Baltimore when he was 13 years old and lived in this area for most of his life. He became the anchor sports person of the popular TV show Wide World of Sports, which was held on Saturday afternoons from starting in 1961 until the 1980s. And then he was also the main anchor person for many of the Olympics that ABC covered, including those 1972 Munich Olympics, which I attended. Jim McKay, born September 24th, 1921. September 25th was the birthday of the great English marathon runner Ron Hill. He was born that day in 1938. Ron Hill has the most amazing streak of any person in sports history. He ran at least a mile or more. He ran every single day, whether it be training or competition, every single day for over 52 years. Unbelievable. I think I saw on the internet, it says something like 52 years and 19 days or thereabout. Incredible how he ran every day despite some injuries. And he lived to be 82 years old. For much of his life, he ran every single day. Incredible. Including over 100 marathons he ran. He competed for Great Britain in 3 Olympic Games, 1964 Tokyo, 1968 Mexico City, and 1972 Munich. He finished in 6th place in that marathon that I saw, where I said earlier Frank Shorter won. Ron Hill came in 6th place. Never quite won an Olympic medal, but he did win many other big races, including the Boston Marathon in 1970 and the British Commonwealth Games gold medal in 1970 in Edinburgh, Scotland. He came here to Baltimore 5 years in a row from about, I think it was 1974 to 78, and he ran the Maryland Marathon, which I also ran. some of those years, and I actually got to meet him at a party in 1978 here in Baltimore, the day of the Maryland Marathon. The first time he ran in 1974, he won, and the next 4 years, he finished second in 75, third in 76, fourth in 77, and fifth in 78 out of many hundreds of runners. That's still very good, but then he decided that was enough for the Maryland Marathon at 5 years in a row. He went down one place each year, but still very good out of hundreds of runners, and did win it in 74. A wonderful man, Ron Hill, who dedicated 52 years of running every single day. September 26th was the birthday of the wonderful singer Olivia Newton-John. She was born in England on that day in 1947. When she was very young, her family moved to Australia for a while, and then she came to the United States later. And she sang many beautiful songs, one of which was called I Honestly Love You. That was one of the top songs of 1974. And sadly, she died just last year on August 8th, 2022, 73 years old. September 27th, that was the day that my mother and I came back from that trip to Europe in 1972. We came back on the SS France, the ship, a great ship. We left France on September 22nd and arrived in New York on September 27th after that 4-week trip to Denmark, Germany, Holland, and France. September 28th, that was the day in 1960 the great baseball player Ted Williams played his last game at Fenway Park, Boston, where he played for the Red Sox for many years. Would you believe, not just his last game, but the last time he came to bat, he hit a home run. What a wonderful way to end his career. He had 521 home runs altogether, but I'm pretty sure he's the only very famous player, Hall of Fame player, who ever hit a home run his last time at bat. September 29th, that was the day in 1979, Pope John Paul II traveled to Ireland, becoming the first Catholic Pope to ever go to Ireland. And I was part of a crowd of 1 million people at Phoenix Park in Dublin to see Pope John Paul II. That was one of many interesting events I saw on that trip, a 15-week trip in 1979. And I happened to be there, and imagine 1/3 of the country was in one place at one time. About 1 million people in Phoenix Park, Dublin, to see Pope John Paul II. September 30th, the last day of the month, that was the day in 1927 that the great baseball player Babe Ruth hit home run number 60 of that 1927 season. The last day of the regular season. The Yankees had already won the American League pennant. They went on to World Series where they played the Pittsburgh Pirates and beat them in 4 games straight, where Babe Ruth hit another 2 home runs. But when you do events in the World Series, that's a separate record from the regular season. So he hit his 60th home run on September 30th, 1927. And that record stood for 34 years until Roger Maris had one more home run, 61, in 1961. It just so happens. But also, on September 30th, 1972, just 3 days after returning from that incredible trip of 27 days to Europe, on the last day of the month here in Baltimore, at a rally at the Inner Harbor, I met Senator George McGovern, who was the Democratic nominee for President of the United States. And he went on, the election was in November, it was November 7th. He did lose to Richard Nixon, who was already president for 4 years and ran for a second term. But I was very happy to meet the man I would vote for president, Senator George McGovern from South Dakota, a very nice man. I'm happy to say I met him, and that was the first time I ever voted in a presidential election in 1972. And every 4 years since then, through 2020, I've never missed a presidential election. I voted in 13 presidential elections thus far, and next year should be number 14 in 2024. So I met Senator George McGovern the last day of that month of September in 1972. So those are events from history and my own personal life to share with all of you today for the month of September. This is Phil Easter, the Amazing Memory Man. We'll see you next time, another story on another subject. Thank you and good night.